Get out. You're not invited. The words struck the vaulted ceiling of my own dining room and came back down on me like falling plaster. My son-in-law's fist slammed against the oak table, and 11 pieces of my late wife's crystal jumped and rang, a small chorus of glass screaming in a house that had once known nothing but quiet. He was standing in front of a fireplace I had built. He was shouting across a table I had commissioned. He was wearing a suit paid for, though he did not know I knew it yet, with money stolen out of my name. I did not shout back, I did not beg, I did not remind him whose deed sat in whose safe. I smiled, a slow, cold, patient smile, the kind a man learns after 40 years of watching structures fail, when he finally sees the exact hairline crack that will bring the whole thing down. Then I stood up, walked past 8 place settings that had no place for me, crossed my own foyer, and put my hand on the brass knob of my own front door. They thought I was leaving. Before I take you back through the 8 months that led me to that doorway, do me one small kindness. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your city right now. It genuinely warms me to know where in the world these words are landing. And if you have ever been made small in a room you paid for, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. This story is for you now. Let me tell you how a man who spent his life keeping other people's buildings standing very nearly let his own life collapse on top of him, and what he did when he finally saw the crack. Snow was falling on Brookline Hills that Christmas Eve, the fat, unhurried kind that erases a landscape rather than covering it. Outside my windows, the manicured lawns, and the wrought iron gates, and the long, curving driveways of Connecticut's most self-satisfied neighborhood were disappearing under a soft white amnesia. Inside, 3 fireplaces breathed. The air carried roasted turkey, rosemary, clove, and the particular perfume of a wine expensive enough to announce itself before you ever tasted it. It was the kind of scene they photograph for the covers of luxury greeting cards. Perfect, warm, unviable, and underneath that flawless surface, the foundation of my family had already rotted completely through. My name is Walter Hensley. I am 70 years old, and for 40 of those years I was a structural engineer. I spent my working life reading steel the way other men read faces. I understood the load-bearing capacity of concrete pillars, the fatigue limits of welded joints, the invisible stress points where a tower quietly decides, years in advance, how and when it will one day come down. Developers paid me a great deal of money because I could stand in front of a set of blueprints and see disaster before disaster had even been drafted. I could spot a fatal flaw in a 40-story building from across a room. I could not spot one at my own dinner table. I remember standing in front of the mirror in my basement bedroom that evening. And yes, I will explain in due course how a man ends up sleeping in the basement of a house he owns outright. Adjusting the dark burgundy silk tie Eleanor bought me for our 30th anniversary. My hands were steady. They had always been steady. I smoothed the lapels of my best charcoal suit and looked at the man in the glass. Tall still, thinner than he had been. Hair gone entirely white, eyes the same eyes that had signed off on bridges. People still drove across every morning, without a single thought for the man who had guaranteed they would hold. Eleanor had been gone 2 years. She took the warmth of the house with her when she went. We bought this estate 3 decades ago, back when the mortgage on it terrified me so badly I could not sleep, and I paid that mortgage off 10 years early, with overtime and missed weekends, and a stubbornness that bordered on cruelty toward myself. It was not a status symbol. It was proof. Proof that the boy who grew up in a rented duplex with a leaking roof had built something that would not leak, would not fail, would not be taken. It was supposed to be the place where I ran out the clock in peace. I climbed the basement stairs, walked the length of the hall, and stepped through the threshold into my own grand dining room. And I stopped dead. The table was still there, of course. Heavy oak, commissioned from a craftsman in Litchfield the year Vanessa turned 4, chosen by Eleanor because she wanted something that would outlive us both. It had, beautiful, unyielding, absurdly strong. I had helped carry it into this room myself, and thrown my back out doing it, and Eleanor had laughed at me for a week. It was dressed like something out of a period film. Silver candelabra, fresh pine and cranberry along the center. Porcelain that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, laid with a precision that suggested someone had measured with a ruler. And I counted the plates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 plates. 8 linen napkins folded into 8 identical peaks. 8 crystal glasses throwing 8 small fractured rainbows, onto the tablecloth from the chandelier above. I looked around the room and did the other arithmetic. My son-in-law, Bradley Calloway, 34 years old, pouring champagne with the theatrical wrist flick of a man who had watched somebody do it in a film. My daughter, Vanessa, 32, the only child Eleanor and I ever had, fussing over silverware that did not need fussing over, her shoulders up somewhere near her ears. Bradley's mother and father, planted on the far side of the table, sipping and surveying with the unearned serenity of people who have been told they are about to come into money. And four men I had never seen before in my life. They sat very still. Expensive suits cut close, hair slicked back with the uniformity of a costume rather than a preference. They did not lean in when spoken to. They did not laugh at Bradley's jokes. Their eyes moved around my dining room the way an appraiser's eyes move around an estate sale. Pricing the chandelier, pricing the paintings, pricing the man in the doorway. They did not look like guests. They looked like collectors. Bradley, Vanessa, Bradley's mother, Bradley's father, four strangers. Eight chairs at the table. 8 plates on the table, and no chair for me. I stood in the doorway of the room where I had carved 30 Thanksgiving turkeys, and I understood that I had not been forgotten. Forgetting is an accident. This was arithmetic. Someone had sat down, counted the guests, and decided that the man who owned the house was not one of them. There is a particular loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness of standing in a crowded room that has organized itself around your absence. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the old, hot, blinding fury of a man who has been insulted in his own house. And then, thank God, the engineer took over. Anger makes you reckless. Anger makes you shout, and shouting is what they wanted. Shouting is evidence. Shouting is the old man losing control, and there were witnesses in the room, and I understood already, without yet knowing how much I understood, that witnesses were the entire point of this dinner. Calm makes you dangerous, so I did not ask why. I turned on my heel, walked down the hall to my study, one of the few rooms they had not yet colonized, and took hold of my reading chair. Heavy leather, brass tacks, a gift from Eleanor the year I made partner. I gripped the armrests and I dragged it. The legs shrieked against the hardwood the whole length of the hallway. It is an ugly sound, wood on wood under weight, and it went through that house like a saw through a board. The polite chatter in the dining room stopped, as though someone had pulled a plug. I dragged the chair through the doorway. I dragged it the length of the table. I dragged it to the head, my seat, the seat I had occupied for 30 years, now occupied by nobody because Bradley had not quite had the nerve to take it while I was still standing in the building. I wedged it in hard between Bradley and the nearest of the slick-suited strangers, forcing them both to shift. Then I crossed to the antique buffet, took down a spare ceramic plate and a plain fork, and set them in front of myself. Not the porcelain, not the crystal. A plate and a fork, and I sat down. I looked around that table slowly, meeting every pair of eyes in the room, one by one, my face entirely empty. It is a thing you learn in a deposition. You do not have to say anything. You simply have to be more comfortable with the silence than they are. The silence was total. It was thick enough to lean against. The four strangers exchanged glances, irritated, confused, recalculating. Bradley's parents looked at me with open, undisguised disgust, as though a vagrant had wandered in off the road and sat down at their banquet. And Vanessa, my daughter, the girl I carried on my shoulders through the state fair until my knees gave out. The girl whose fever I sat with for 3 nights running when she was 6. The girl whose college tuition I paid in full, in cash, so she would never begin her adult life owing anyone anything. She looked at her lap, her face went red. She did not look at me, she did not say a word. She was not confused, she was embarrassed. There is a difference, and I have had a long time since to think about it. Confusion is not knowing what is happening. Embarrassment is knowing exactly what is happening, and hoping it will be over quickly. Bradley's face went the color of raw brick. The vein in his neck came up against his collar. He stood so fast his chair cracked into the wall behind him, and he brought his fist down on Eleanor's table hard enough to make the silverware jump. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He leaned across the wood, and his eyes had nothing behind them but venom. "Get out. You're not invited to this dinner." He was shouting at me across a table I bought, under a roof I paid for, in a room I designed the load calculations for myself. I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice. I looked at that furious red face and I smiled, and I watched the rage in his eyes stutter. just for a half second, into something that was not rage, into hesitation. Because a man screaming at an old man expects the old man to shrink, and when the old man smiles instead, some ancient animal part of the brain sits up and asks a question. I placed my fork down on the empty plate. I stood, unhurried, and smoothed the wrinkles from my suit. "Enjoy your dinner, Bradley," I said. My voice was perfectly level. I turned my back on all 8 of them and walked toward the foyer. Behind me I heard him scoff, heard him mutter something to his guests about his senile father-in-law, heard the nervous, obliging laughter of people who had a great deal of money riding on Bradley Calloway, being exactly who he claimed to be. They thought I was retreating. They thought I was humiliated, beaten, walking out into the snow to nurse my shame. My hand closed around the cold brass of the doorknob, and something very quiet and very old settled over me. It was the feeling I used to get on a job site at 5 in the morning, when everything was calculated, and checked, and triple-checked, and there was nothing left to do but watch it happen. I was not leaving. I was opening the door for the people who had been waiting outside for the last 40 minutes. But to understand how I came to be standing at my own front door on Christmas Eve, you have to go back 8 months. You have to go back to the day my judgment failed. The day grief made me exactly the kind of structure a predator looks for. Not weak, weakened. There is a difference there too. Eleanor died in April. The cancer was aggressive, unapologetic, and fast, and it did not negotiate. In March, she was on her knees in the back garden, with her hands in the dirt, planting hydrangeas and laughing at some stupid joke I made from the patio. By late May, I was standing in a black suit in wet grass watching a box go into the ground. 40 years I spent making sure that other people's structures could weather anything. Wind load, seismic load, snow load. I knew to 3 decimal places how much a thing could take before it failed. And then the load-bearing pillar of my own life was removed without warning, and the entire structure of me went unstable overnight. I was a 70-year-old man wandering echoing hallways, eating standing up over the sink because sitting at that oak table alone was unbearable, sleeping on one side of a king bed, and never once, not in 2 years, rolling over onto hers. Grief does something specific to a man's engineering. It does not make you stupid. It makes you willing. It makes you desperate to believe the load calculation somebody hands you rather than run it yourself, because running it yourself means being awake at 3 in the morning with your own thoughts, and you will do very nearly anything to avoid that. A vulnerable man is not a weak man. He is simply a man whose safety factor has been used up. And predators do not look for weakness. They look for spent safety factor. It was a rainy Sunday 3 weeks after the funeral, when Vanessa and Bradley came over. We sat in the living room. The rain came down the tall windows in sheets. Vanessa looked around the room, and her eyes kept snagging on the places where her mother used to be. The reading chair by the lamp, the corner of the sofa with the permanent slight dent in it, the little side table where Eleanor's glasses had lived for 30 years, and where they still, God help me, were sitting. Bradley leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He had a particular expression he wore when he was about to make a pitch. Earnest, weighted, slightly pained, as though what he was about to say cost him something. "Dad," Vanessa began, and her voice trembled in exactly the right way. "We hate seeing you here by yourself. Mom wouldn't want this. This house is too much for one person." I looked down into my coffee. "I'm managing, sweetheart. It's just quiet, that's all." Bradley put his hand over Vanessa's. A perfect photograph of the supportive husband. "Walter," he said, and he always used my first name like a man using a tool he had just been handed and was still getting the feel of, "We want to help. Look, I'll be straight with you. The company's entering a crucial expansion phase. We're scaling operations, which means redirecting a serious portion of our personal capital into the business for the next year, maybe 2. And at the same time, we've been worried sick about you, both of us. The isolation out here isn't good for a man your age." He let that sit for exactly the right length of time. "We were thinking of giving up the lease downtown. Moving in here, with you." He spread his hands, as though the elegance of it had only just occurred to him. "It's a win-win. We free up the capital I need, and more importantly, we're here, to take care of you." That was the lie. And I want to be very clear about the architecture of it, because if you are listening to this and you have an aging parent, or you are an aging parent, I need you to see how it was built. It was not a lie that asked me for anything. It was a lie that offered me something. It was a lie in which they were the ones making the sacrifice, giving up their independence, their downtown life, their privacy, all to look after a grieving old man. It cost them, you see. That was the genius of it. I was not being asked to hand over my house. I was being invited to graciously permit two loving young people to inconvenience themselves on my behalf. I should have run the numbers. I should have asked the questions I would have asked of any contractor. What capital exactly? Scaling to what? Show me the books. Show me the runway. Show me one single audited page. 40 years of professional paranoia, and I did not ask one of them. Because Vanessa was the only piece of Eleanor left on this earth. Because I wanted to hear footsteps on the stairs again. Because I wanted to smell coffee brewing that I had not brewed myself. Because I wanted, with an ache that I am not too proud to describe as animal, the comforting illusion of a family in a house. So I ignored the things I had already seen. I ignored the way Bradley's charm never quite reached his eyes. I ignored the fact that in 4 years of marriage, he had never once asked me a question about my life. That was not, on some level, a question about my money. And most of all, I ignored the small, terrible thing I had noticed at their wedding and buried immediately. The way my daughter went quiet. Genuinely quiet, physically smaller. Whenever Bradley took over a conversation. I had seen it. I had catalogued it. And I had filed it away under Not My Business, which is the drawer where fathers put the things that frighten them. You're welcome to stay, I told them, and my voice was thick. This house is big enough for all of us. Don't worry about rent. Don't worry about utilities. Bradley, you focus on your business. I looked at my daughter. Vanessa, you just be here. She hugged me. I remember that. I remember thinking that it was the first time anyone had put their arms around me since the funeral, and that I would have signed anything in that moment. That turned out to be a more accurate thought than I knew. They moved in 3 days later. The invasion did not announce itself. It never does. Buildings do not fall down. They are taken down one small tolerance at a time by loads nobody bothered to add up. It began with boxes, then furniture. Mine going out to the garage, theirs coming in, and Bradley directing the movers with the loud, expansive authority of a newly crowned king walking a conquered province. I stood in my own foyer and watched a stranger tell 3 men where my things belonged, and I told myself I was being a stubborn old man who had forgotten how to share a house. The illusion of a harmonious family arrangement did not survive 24 hours. It was their first night. I had gone out for my evening walk, a strict routine, 3 miles every night, rain or snow, because a man's joints are a maintenance schedule, and I have never in my life skipped a maintenance schedule. The cold air felt good. I remember being hopeful. I remember thinking about breakfast the next morning, about having someone to hand the sports section to. I came back a little after 9, up the drive onto the porch, key into the lock, into the foyer. The house was dark and very quiet. I reached for the security panel on the wall and entered my 4-digit code, the same code I had entered every night for 15 years. The keypad flashed red, a hard electronic beep. Inland code. I frowned. My fingers are 70, my memory is not. I entered it again deliberately. Red, beep, inland code. Something turned over unpleasantly in my chest. That system had never once failed. I had specified it myself. 3rd attempt. The panel locked me out entirely and began to shriek, the pre-dispatch tone, 60 seconds before the alarm company called the police. And Bradley appeared at the top of my staircase, silk pajamas, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, entirely, luxuriously relaxed at 9 o'clock at night, in a house he had lived in for 11 hours. Bradley, I called over the alarm. The panel's malfunctioning. My code isn't working. He came down the stairs slowly. He was not hurrying. That is the detail I have never been able to shake. He was not hurrying. He did not look like a guest whose father-in-law was locked out of his own home. He looked like a landlord dealing, patiently, with a tenant who had confused himself again. He walked past me, reached over my shoulder, entered a code I had never seen. The alarm died. The green light came up. I stared at the panel, then at him. What did you just do? Why didn't my code work? He took a sip of his water. His eyes met mine with an infuriating calm. Oh, my apologies, Walter. Mean to mention it. The system had a glitch this afternoon while you were out. Kept false triggering, drove Vanessa up the wall. So I went ahead and reset the master code to clear the fault. That smile, rehearsed to the millimeter. Just synced it to the one we used at the apartment. Easier that way. I'll write the new numbers down for you in the morning. And he turned his back on me and walked toward my kitchen. Good night, Walter. I stood alone in my dim foyer looking at that green light. A glitch. It was such a small, plausible thing. That is precisely why it worked. If he had changed the locks, I would have called the police. If he had taken my keys, I would have thrown him out on the spot. But he changed 4 digits and offered a technical explanation, and any objection I raised would have made me sound exactly like what he was already. Even then, quietly telling people I was. He did not write the numbers down in the morning. He wrote them down 11 days later, when I asked for the fourth time, on the back of a receipt, and he handed it to me the way you hand a child a coloring book. That was the first load. It was not the last. Over the following weeks, they came in a steady, patient sequence, each one individually reasonable, each one impossible to refuse without becoming the villain of the story. My library became Bradley's office, because he needed a professional background for investor calls, and surely I wasn't using all those books, and it would only be for a few months. My car was moved out of the garage and onto the street, because Bradley's leased German sedan needed to be principal for client meetings, and my old Buick could handle a little weather, couldn't it? The thermostat went up and my study door started staying shut, because Vanessa was always cold, and after all, I'd said this was their home now, hadn't I? And then came the stairs. Vanessa brought it up over dinner, 6 weeks in, with the careful tone of a woman who has rehearsed a speech in her car. Dad, we've been talking. Those stairs are a real hazard. Your knees aren't what they were, and if you fell up there, at night, and we didn't hear you, her eyes actually filled. That is the part I want you to understand. Her eyes actually filled with tears. The basement suite has everything. Full bath, kitchenette, its own entrance, no stairs. It'd give us all peace of mind. Bradley said nothing at all. That was his craft. He never made the ask. He let his wife make it, and he sat there radiating quiet, supportive concern. And if I said no, I was saying no to my daughter's love and my daughter's tears, not to my son-in-law's ambition. I said yes. I want to be honest about why, because I think there are people listening who have said yes to something like this and are ashamed of it. I did not say yes because I was confused or frail or bullied. I said yes because my daughter had cried about my safety at my own table, and it was the first time in 6 weeks she had seemed to see me at all. I said yes because it was the price of being loved by the only person left on earth who shared blood with Eleanor. That is how they get you. Not with force, with the invoice for affection. So a 70-year-old man with a paid-off deed in his safe carried his own clothes down to the basement of his own house and hung them in a closet that smelled of dryer sheets and damp, and told himself he was being a good father. Above my head, every night I could hear them walking around in my life. The illusion did not break gently. It broke at 1 in the morning, and it broke loudly. I was lying rigid in the basement bed, staring at a ceiling 18 inches lower than the one I had slept under for 30 years, listening to the furnace drone. And then a sound came down through the floorboards, a long, heavy, dragging scrape. Wood on hardwood under real weight. It was coming from the master bedroom, from my room, from Eleanor's room. I was up and in my shoes before I had decided to be. I went up the basement stairs quietly and cracked the door into the main hall. The front door was standing wide open. Freezing air was pouring into my foyer, and Bradley was in the doorway, shoulder down, shoving a large piece of furniture out onto the porch. Moonlight caught the hand-carved floral inlay on the dark wood, and my breath stopped in my throat. It was Eleanor's vanity. Her grandmother carried that vanity from Vermont in 1931. Eleanor sat at it every single morning of our marriage, brushing out her hair with a silver-backed brush, and every morning of my life I woke to the sound of it. I had asked exactly one thing of Vanessa when they moved in. One thing: leave your mother's vanity where it is. Bradley put his shoulder into it and shoved. It went over the edge of the porch. It came down the concrete steps in a series of splitting cracks. I heard the joints let go. I heard 94 years of dovetail and glue and Vermont oak come apart on my own front walk, and it landed in a heap on the frozen driveway. He dragged the pieces across the wet pavement to the rented dumpster he had parked there that afternoon. He heaved them in, board by board. Then he wiped his palms on his pants, took out his phone, and typed a message. He was smiling slightly at whatever he wrote. He had just destroyed the last physical object my wife's hands had touched every day for 30 years. And he was smiling at his phone. I stood in the dark of that stairwell, and I did not move and I did not breathe, and something in my mind, something that had been trying very hard for 6 months to file all of this under adjustment period, finally, mercifully, gave up. Because a man does not do that to make space. A man does that to erase. This was not about my knees. This was not about my safety. This was the systematic, deliberate demolition of every trace that Walter and Eleanor Hensley had ever lived in this house. They were not taking my home from me. They were taking my history and putting it in a skip. The next morning I did not confront him. I sat at the little table in my basement suite, with a cup of black coffee going cold in my hands, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I did the only thing I have ever been genuinely good at. I ran the analysis. A foundation does not crack without a load. Buildings do not simply decide to fall. There is always a force, and the force is always measurable, and if you can measure it, you can name it, and if you can name it, you can defeat it. Bradley was applying enormous sustained pressure to my life, isolating me, erasing me, moving me physically downward through the house like sediment. Why, not greed? Greed is patient. Greed would have waited for me to die. I am 70. I have a bad knee. The arithmetic there is not difficult. Greed would have played the loving son-in-law for another decade and inherited the whole thing with a clean conscience and no risk. This was not patient. This was a man on a clock, throwing that vanity in a dumpster. The aggression of it, the contempt, the sheer carelessness of doing it where I might hear. That was not a man managing an inheritance. That was a man who had already spent it. Bradley was not waiting for my house. Bradley needed my house. Now. And that meant there was a deadline somewhere, and a deadline meant a document, and a document meant paper. So I stopped being a grieving father and became something I had not been in 6 months. I became an engineer again. I stopped talking at dinner. I started listening. I began, quite deliberately, to be slightly slower on the stairs than I actually was, to ask people to repeat things I had heard perfectly well. It cost me nothing. It bought me a great deal. A man who is not a threat is a man nobody bothers to lock the door against. And within 2 weeks, the anomaly presented itself. Bradley Calloway claimed to run a technology company. He spent his days locked in my library on conference calls loud enough to hear through 2 doors, throwing around words like runway and burn rate and Series B. And this man, this creature of the pure digital future, had developed an obsessive, physical, almost animal relationship with the mail. Gary had delivered to this house for 15 years. For 15 years, the mail dropped through the brass slot in my front door at around 11 in the morning and sat on the mat until somebody picked it up. Not anymore. Every morning at 10:50 precisely, Bradley Calloway walked out onto my front porch with a cup of coffee and waited. In November, in the snow. He stood on that porch in the cold with no coat and waited for Gary to come up the walk, and he took the stack out of Gary's hands personally, and he smiled and said something friendly, and then he went straight into the library and shut the door and stayed there for an hour. And when the mail eventually appeared on the kitchen counter for Vanessa and me, grocery flyers, pizza coupons, the gas bill. Never a bank statement, never a pension notice, never anything from my insurer, my broker, my attorney. In 6 months, not one single piece of substantive correspondence addressed to Walter Hensley had reached Walter Hensley's hands. A wealthy, successful entrepreneur was standing outside in the freezing cold every single morning, like a dog waiting at a butcher's door. What was coming through my mail slot that he could not afford for me to see? The chance to find out came on a Tuesday in December. They announced at breakfast that they were driving into the city for lunch with potential investors. They dressed for it. Vanessa, in the pearl earrings her mother left her. Bradley in a suit that cost more than my first car. She kissed my cheek on the way out with a warmth so manufactured I could practically hear the machinery. The moment their taillights cleared the gate, I moved. Up the basement stairs, through the kitchen, into the garage. I went straight past the trash cans to the blue recycling bin in the corner. Bradley was meticulous about his image and utterly sloppy about everything underneath it, which is a combination I have met 100 times on job sites, and which has never once failed to be fatal. He had bought himself a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder for the library. Very professional, very corporate, and he emptied it directly into the household recycling. Unbagged, twice a week, for 6 months, because it never once occurred to him that the senile old man in the basement might be a problem. I lifted the lid. Inside was a snowdrift of white paper strips, thousands of them, tens of thousands, an absolute chaos of destroyed information. I plunged both hands in up to the elbows and scooped it into a garbage bag, and I carried that bag down the stairs into my basement and emptied it across the bed under the reading lamp. It looked impossible. It looked like the definition of impossible. But I had spent 4 decades solving structural equations for towers and river crossings, and I had the specific, terrible patience of a man who has begun to understand that his survival depends on the answer. I started with sorting, not reading, sorting, by stock, by weight, by texture. Most of it was cheap laser paper, the discarded drafts of proposals that I suspect never went anywhere at all. But after half an hour of digging, my fingers found something different. Thicker, heavier, a distinct glossy finish, and a watermark. Corporate stationery. I gathered every glossy strip I could find and swept the rest onto the floor. Then I sat on the edge of that mattress with my back aching from the damp and a roll of tape from the nightstand, and I began to rebuild. It took hours, a curved letter here, a blue rule there. Match the shred lines, match the ink density. Work from the margins inward, exactly the way you work a fracture pattern backward to find the point of initiation. After an hour, I had the top left corner. My breath went out of me. It was the logo of the bank. Not any bank, the bank. The institution where Eleanor and I had held our accounts for 31 years. The bank that had issued the mortgage on this house, and the bank that had sent me, on a Thursday in 2009, the single most satisfying letter I have ever received in my life. Confirmation that the mortgage was discharged in full 10 years early. My hands were not steady anymore. I worked faster. I found a date, 4 days prior. I found a strip carrying the recipient address block, and I taped it down and read the name printed there in bold black ink. It was not Bradley Calloway. It was not Vanessa Hensley Calloway. It was addressed to Walter Hensley, to me, to the man in the basement. He was intercepting my personal financial correspondence, shredding it in my library, and hiding the remains in my garage. I had not received a letter from that branch in 15 years. There was no reason on earth for that bank to write to me. I scoured the bedspread for the rest, taping down fragments as I found them. The text was broken. The shredder had eaten whole words. But there was enough. There was more than enough. One fragment read, equity line. Another, appraised value of the subject property. And then, at last, I found the center paragraph, and I smoothed the tape over the jagged edges, and I read the reconstructed sentence out loud in the silence of that basement, and my own voice sounded like a stranger's. Congratulations, Mr. Hensley. You have been approved for the home equity line of credit you requested, in the amount of $1,500,000. I sat very still on the edge of the bed and stared at that taped-together page until the letters came apart in my vision. I had not applied for a loan. I had not spoken to a loan officer. I had not filled out a form. I had not requested a single dollar from any financial institution on this earth since 1996. But my name was on the approval. And here is the thing that turned my blood to ice water. The thing that a man who has spent 40 years reading documents understood immediately, and that took me a full minute to be able to breathe through. The bank had done its job. That letter existed because the bank had a process. Someone applies. The bank writes to the property owner at the property address to confirm. That letter was the system working exactly as designed. That letter was the smoke detector going off. And for 6 months, a man had been standing on my porch every morning at 10:50 in the freezing cold with the sole and entire purpose of catching that letter before it hit my mat. He had not defeated the safeguard. He had simply stood in front of it. A line of credit for $1.5 million, drawn against the equity of a house I owned free and clear. You do not do that by accident. You do not do that with charm. To move a sum of that size against an unencumbered property requires a forged signature, a compromised notary, and a verification chain that somebody has learned exactly how to walk through. Bradley Calloway was not an arrogant houseguest. He was a professional, and my daughter was helping him. I folded the taped pages into a small pouch and hid them under the insoles of my winter boots, and I sat in the dark for a long time, because a question had arrived, and it was a worse question than the loan. If he was bold enough to forge my signature for $1.5 million, what had he already taken that I hadn't noticed? I waited until the following morning. Bradley announced a networking lunch. Vanessa was in the kitchen with her phone. I mentioned vaguely that I was going up to the den to hunt for an old tax document, and I made sure to take the stairs slowly enough that she looked up, registered the old man laboring, and looked back down at her screen. The den was a small room on the second floor that Bradley had judged too cramped for a man of his ambitions. It was the last square footage in the house that was still mine. I shut the door and crossed to the landscape painting on the far wall, swung it out on its hinges, and entered the 6-digit code on the keypad of the wall safe behind it. The steel door clicked and swung open. Passport, emergency cash, insurance policies, the deed. Everything precisely where it should be. I felt a wash of relief so strong it was almost nausea. Then I reached into the back of the compartment for the small navy velvet box. I knew before I opened it. I knew from the weight. There is no mistaking it, a thing that is supposed to have mass and does not. I pressed the clasp, the lid sprang, the velvet was empty, Eleanor's diamond, 2 carats flawless on a fine platinum chain. I saved for 3 years to buy that necklace for our 30th anniversary. 3 years of packed lunches, and a coat I wore 2 winters past its funeral. She wore it every day, every single day, to the grocery store, to the garden, to chemotherapy. I took it off her myself in that hospital room, and I put it in this safe the afternoon she died, because I could not bear to see it sitting on her dresser, catching the light while she was in the ground. $30,000 perhaps to a jeweler. To me it was not a piece of jewelry, it was 30 years of a man's devotion compressed into a stone. And it was gone. I gripped that empty box until my knuckles went white, and I want to be honest with you. The engineer left me completely. Every calculation, every strategy, every ounce of the patience I had been building for 2 weeks. Gone, burned off in an instant of pure white rage. I left the safe hanging open. I went down the hall and down the grand staircase, and my footsteps were not slow, and they were not the footsteps of a frail man, and I did not care. Vanessa was pouring coffee, humming. I brought the empty box down on the granite counter, hard enough to crack the sound off the ceiling. She jumped. Coffee slopped over the rim and onto her white sweater. "Dad, what is wrong with you? Where is your mother's necklace, Vanessa?" My voice was very low and very steady. She froze, and I watched the color go out of my daughter's face like water going out of a sink. Her eyes went everywhere in that kitchen except to me. I don't know what you're talking about. The safe upstairs is locked." I took a step toward her. 3 people in this world know that combination. Me, your mother, and you. I opened it 10 minutes ago. The box is empty. Where is the necklace? Sweat came up on her forehead. She backed into the island and gripped the edge of it behind her. "Dad, I swear I haven't touched it. You must have moved it. You must have put it somewhere and do not lie to me in my own house." And then the front door opened. Bradley came in shedding his wool coat, and he read that room in about a second and a half. His eyes went from my face to the empty box on the counter, to his wife's white sweater, and her whiter face. He did not look surprised. He looked annoyed, like a man whose meeting is running long. "What's going on here?" He moved smoothly between us, between me and my daughter, in my kitchen, and crossed his arms. "Your wife has taken Eleanor's anniversary necklace out of my personal safe," I said. "She is the only living person besides me who has the code." Bradley let out a long theatrical sigh. He uncrossed his arms, and he gave me a look of such deep, tender, patronizing pity that I understood right then that I had made a serious tactical error. "Come on, Walter." His voice dropped into something soft and warm and utterly poisonous. "Listen to yourself. Listen to what you're doing right now. You are standing in your kitchen accusing your own daughter, your only child, 3 weeks before Christmas, of being a thief. Over a piece of jewelry. I did not misplace it. He came closer. And here it is. Here is the part I need you to hear if you hear nothing else in this story. Because it is the single most dangerous sentence in the English language, and it is spoken softly, always, and it is spoken by someone who loves you. Walter, gently, kindly, let's be honest with each other. The grief. Losing Eleanor. It's been so hard on you and nobody blames you for that, nobody. But you've been slipping, we've both seen it, you know you have." A pause, beautifully judged. "Do you not remember our conversation last month? You told me you were worried about keeping valuables in a wall safe. You said you wanted to move it somewhere more secure. You asked me not to make a fuss about it. I stood there in my own kitchen, with my mouth slightly open. Because I have a very good memory. I have an exceptional memory, and I had never in my life had that conversation. But he said it with such total, gentle certainty. And Vanessa was nodding. My daughter was nodding, her eyes wet, her hand over her mouth. And there were 2 of them and 1 of me, and for a moment, for one genuinely terrifying moment, standing there holding an empty velvet box, I heard a small voice at the back of my own skull ask, "Did I? That is what they do to you. That is the real theft. They are not simply stealing your money and your wife's diamonds. They are stealing the instrument you would use to detect the robbery. They are coming for the gauge itself." I looked at Bradley Calloway's kind, concerned, entirely fabricated face, and I felt the ground of my own mind tilt underneath me. And then, thank God, 40 years of professional discipline surfaced like a hand out of deep water and grabbed hold of one single fact. I had a taped-together bank letter under the insole of my left boot. I was not slipping, I was being demolished. On schedule, by a man with a permit, I let my shoulders drop, I let my hand shake slightly on the counter. I let my eyes go unfocused and confused and old. "Maybe," I said quietly. "Maybe you're right. I've not been sleeping well, Bradley." And I watched the triumph flash across his face before he could bury it. And I watched him put a warm hand on my shoulder and squeeze. And I let him. "Of course you haven't," he said. "Get some rest, Walter. We'll sort it out." I went down to my basement and shut the door and sat on the bed with my hands folded in my lap for a very long time. I was not confused. I was calculating. They had just told me, both of them, exactly what their weapon was. They were building a case that I was not of sound mind. And a man who is not of sound mind cannot testify, cannot object, cannot sue, cannot refuse. They did not need me dead. They needed me diagnosed. The next morning I took my walk. 3 blocks out of sight of every window in that house, I straightened my back, took out my phone, and called the only man in Connecticut I trusted absolutely. 2 days later, I told Vanessa I had a routine appointment with my cardiologist. I made a small production of forgetting where I had put my scarf. She barely glanced up, offering me a wave that had all the warmth of a parking attendant. I walked out my own front door, leaning heavily on a cane I do not need, moving at the pace of a man who has surrendered. 3 blocks. That was all it took. 3 blocks, and then I straightened up, folded the cane under my arm and ordered a car. The ride into the city was a long gray blur of winter. I watched the towers come up out of the haze, 30-40 stories of steel standing perfectly indifferent against a hard sky, and I drew a strange, quiet strength out of them. I put 4 of those buildings up. Not the glass, not the marble, the bones. The parts nobody thinks about until the day the wind comes and they hold. I am Walter Hensley. I built things that outlast hurricanes. I was not going to let a parasite in a rented suit take me down. The office of Kellerman and Whitfield occupied the 34th floor of a tower I had, in fact, done the load review on. Arthur Kellerman was not a lawyer so much as a weapon that had gone to law school. For 30 years he had defended my firm against frivolous claims, negotiated municipal contracts that would have made a bishop swear, and eaten corporate predators for breakfast without loosening his tie. He was 72, silver, and had the eyes of a hawk that has been personally insulted. The receptionist knew my face and walked me straight back. Arthur stood, surprised, and shook my hand. I did not waste his time with pleasantries. I sat down, reached into my coat, and laid the small pouch on his immaculate desk. Then I told him everything. The move-in, the alarm code, the library, the basement, Eleanor's vanity going down the front steps into a dumpster at 1 in the morning, the mail, the recycling bin, the necklace, and the conversation in the kitchen, in which my son-in-law had, with great tenderness, informed me of a memory I do not have. Arthur listened with a stillness I found genuinely frightening. He did not interrupt once. He picked up the taped-together bank letter and held it under his desk lamp and read it twice. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register I had only heard him use in a courtroom. "Walter, this isn't elder abuse. This is a structured financial predation, and it's well advanced." He set the letter down very gently, as though it might go off. "They are not stealing from you. They are liquidating you." He turned to his keyboard. "I'm pulling county property records. And I still have a direct line into the fraud desk at your bank. Marilyn owes me a considerable favor. If a HELOC has been initiated against your property, there is a digital trail, and it will be sitting in the file right now with a timestamp on it." The office went silent except for the clicking. I sat in that leather chair and listened to a man type, and each second of it lasted an hour. I watched his eyes narrow. I watched him scroll. I watched him stop scrolling. He leaned back. He let out a breath through his teeth. "It's worse than you think. Tell me. The 1.5 million line is real. It's not an application, Walter. It's not pending. It's in final underwriting." The bank completed a drive-by appraisal of your estate on the 14th of November. A truck sat outside your house and photographed it, and you never knew. Funds are scheduled to disperse into a newly opened joint account in 14 days. He looked up at me. In 2 weeks, Bradley Calloway will have unrestricted access to $1.5 million of your equity. And the day he draws it down, the lien attaches to your home. You will owe it at 70, on a fixed income. I felt the blood leave my face. Arthur, how is that possible? I never spoke to a loan officer. I never signed anything. They need a wet signature. They need a notary. They need me, physically, in a chair with identification saying yes. Arthur's expression turned very grim. He opened a new tab. He navigated to the county recorder's database. He downloaded a file, and the printer behind him hummed and began pushing out warm paper, and he stapled it, and he slid it across that mahogany desk toward me, with 2 fingers, slowly, the way you slide a photograph of a body toward a witness. They didn't need you in the chair, Walter, he said quietly, tapping the top sheet. Because as far as the state of Connecticut is concerned, you already said yes to everything. 8 months ago. I looked down. The words at the top of the page burned themselves into the back of my eyes. Durable power of attorney. I read the clauses. I read them 3 times because the first 2 times my mind simply refused to accept the sentences. The instrument granted Vanessa Hensley Calloway full and unrestricted authority over the entirety of my financial affairs. Banking, investments, real property, pension, and, the clause that stopped my heart, healthcare decisions, including the authority to consent to placement in a residential care facility. It declared her my sole agent in all matters. It was durable, meaning it survived my incapacity. It was springing on no condition, meaning it was live from the date of execution. It stripped me of my personhood on a single sheet of paper. I never drafted this, I whispered. Arthur, I have never seen this document in my life. Look at the last page. I flipped to it. And there, at the bottom, beside the blue embossed stamp of a notary public, a notary, I would learn later that week, who had notarized 411 documents in a single month and had never met a single one of the signatories, was my signature. Not an approximation, not a rushed forgery. It was perfect, every loop, every angle. The particular hard downstroke on the W that I have been putting on documents since 1979. The slight lift at the end of the Y that I never noticed I did until I saw someone else do it. I have signed my name to structural certifications on 11 bridges. If I had been handed that page cold, I would have sworn under oath that I signed it. Someone had studied me, for months. Someone had sat in my house with samples of my handwriting and practiced. I looked up at Arthur Kellerman, and I said the only thing there was to say. He's been living in my house for 8 months, so he could learn how to be me. Arthur sat looking at that signature for a long moment, and I watched the muscles feather along his jaw. 30 years of corporate litigation had cauterized most of the man's capacity for shock. But this was a client he called a friend, and something in him had gone past professional. Walter, we cannot simply react. I want to call the police right now. I know you do, don't. He leaned forward. Listen to me. If we walk into a station this afternoon with a taped-up letter and a forged POA, what happens? Best case, they open a file and it sits for 6 weeks. And meanwhile, Bradley knows. He knows within a day, because he'll get a call, or a notice, or the bank will freeze the file, and someone will phone the primary contact, which, thanks to that document, is him. And then he panics. He shreds everything in that library. He drains whatever accounts he still has access to. And Walter, Arthur's voice dropped. Read that healthcare clause again. What is the one thing that would make every accusation you ever make against him legally worthless? I read it again, and I understood. A diagnosis, I said. A diagnosis. He has been laying that foundation for 8 months. The confusion, the slipping, the conversations you don't remember. Walter, if he even suspects we're moving, he does not run. He accelerates. He uses that document, which is, until a judge says otherwise, a valid instrument, and he has you assessed and placed. And once you are inside a locked memory care ward with a signed physician's opinion in your file, everything you say for the rest of your life is a symptom. The room was very quiet. He doesn't need to kill me, I said slowly. He needs to file me. Yes, then what do we do? Arthur Kellerman smiled for the first time that afternoon, and it was not a warm expression. We do what you've done your whole career. We don't argue about whether the building is unsound. We let it fail under load, with instruments attached, and we record every reading. We spent 4 hours in that office. By the end of it, we had a structure. First, the legal architecture. Arthur would file, quietly, under seal where he could, a petition to revoke the power of attorney on the grounds of fraudulent execution, and simultaneously deliver the reconstructed bank letter to the fraud desk at my bank, who had a rather urgent institutional interest in not disbursing $1.5 million against a forged instrument. The bank did not stop the loan. That is important. At Arthur's request, the bank let it keep moving on paper, right up to the wire. Because a scheduled disbursement is a clock, and a man on a clock makes mistakes. Second, the instruments. I am an engineer. Every structure I ever signed off on was monitored during load testing. Strain gauges, accelerometers, the works. You do not guess whether a beam is failing. You measure it. I had wired the audio system in that house into the ceilings myself, 15 years earlier, room by room, because Eleanor liked music in the kitchen while she cooked. I knew every cable run in those walls better than I knew the veins on the back of my own hand. Over the next 9 days, in 90-minute windows while Bradley was at his lunches and Vanessa was at her yoga, a 70-year-old man with a bad knee installed 11 micro cameras and 6 audio pickups in his own home. In the ceiling corner of the library, in the crown molding of the dining room, in the foyer above the kitchen. Every one of them legal, my house, my property, and in this state my consent is sufficient for the audio. I ran the whole array back to a tablet. I kept inside a hollowed-out engineering textbook in my basement, and I fed it into the encrypted cloud account Arthur set up under his firm's name, so that even if they found the tablet, they had already lost. Third, and this was the hardest part, I had to become the man they had invented. For 9 days I performed my own decline for an audience of 2. I let my hand tremble when I poured coffee. I asked Vanessa the same question about the Christmas schedule 3 times in one afternoon. I put my keys in the refrigerator and let her find them, and I let her look at Bradley over my head with that expression, that awful, satisfied, pitying expression, and I stood there and let them see an old man frightened by his own mind. I want to tell you it was strategy. It was. It was also the most humiliating thing I have ever done in my life. There were nights I sat on that basement bed, shaking with a rage so total I could hear my own pulse. To be underestimated is an irritation. To perform your own destruction for the entertainment of the people destroying you, and to smile while you do it, that is something else. That takes a piece out of a man that does not grow back. But every day I did it, they got sloppier. And on the 6th night, at 11:42 in the evening, sitting in a basement with a tablet on my knees and a pair of headphones over my white hair, I found out exactly how much of a piece it had been worth. Bradley was in my library. The door was locked. He had a glass of my scotch in his hand and his feet on my desk, and he was on speakerphone with a man whose voice I did not recognize, and my daughter was sitting on the arm of the leather chair beside him. I will not reproduce all of it. Some of it I have never repeated to another living soul and never will. But I heard my son-in-law say this. The secondary problem is handled. The facility upstate sent the admission manifest this afternoon. Locked ward, private suite. They're holding the bed. We put him in the transport van on the morning of the 27th. Once that van clears the driveway, we go straight to the airport. First class to Maui New Year's Eve, sun and a Mai Tai, and the whole thing is somebody else's paperwork. And then my daughter's voice, my Vanessa, Eleanor's girl. And it was not frightened, it was not coerced, it was practical. Are you sure the doctors will sign off on the dementia? Sweetheart, I could hear the smile in it. $10,000 of the advance went to a very accommodating neurologist in Bridgeport. The report is already in the file. Advanced cognitive decline, paranoid ideation, danger to self, airtight, signed, dated, done. A pause, a clink of ice. He'll fight it, she said. Let him. Walter Hensley fighting it is the single best evidence we have. That's the beautiful part, Van. Everything he does from here proves the diagnosis. He objects, that's paranoia. He calls a lawyer, that's paranoia. He tells the officers the son-in-law is stealing from him. Bradley actually laughed. That's the textbook presentation. And Vanessa laughed too. I sat in my basement in the dark with my dead wife's daughter laughing in my ears. I did not weep. I want to be honest about that, because I have thought about it a great deal since, and I think there is something in it worth saying. I did not weep, and it was not strength. It was that a certain thing inside me had already finished dying, quietly some weeks earlier, and I simply had not been informed until that moment. I took the headphones off. I sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then I opened the tablet and typed a message to Arthur Kellerman, and it was 5 words long. I have all of it. His reply came at 4 minutes past midnight. Christmas Eve, all of them under one roof. I'll bring the warrants. Which brings us back to the front door. Back to my hand on the cold brass, and 8 people at a table behind me who thought they were watching a beaten old man walk out into the snow to cry. There is one piece I have not told you yet, and it is the piece that explains the 4 strangers. Arthur's people had spent the week pulling threads, and the threads all led to the same place. Bradley Calloway's technology company had $11 in its operating account, and a website that had been purchased from a template. There was no expansion phase. There had never been a Series B. What there was instead was $490,000 in short-term private lending, secured against nothing, taken at rates that do not appear in any regulated market, from men who do not send letters when a payment is late. That was the clock. That was the pressure on the foundation. Bradley had borrowed against a fortune that was not his, from people who could not be told no, and the $1.5 million was not greed. It was survival, and the 4 men at my Christmas table were the lenders. He had brought them into my house with the good crystal out and his parents playing the family and his wife in her mother's pearls, to show them the collateral, to let them see the chandelier and the oak and the acreage and reassure themselves that the money was real and the old man was manageable. That dinner was not a celebration. It was a viewing. They had put out 8 plates because 8 people had business there. I had no plate because I was not a guest at that table. I was the merchandise, so I opened my front door. Cold came in first, a great white gust of it, snow swirling across the marble of my foyer, the wind cutting through that overheated house like a blade through fat. And Arthur Kellerman stepped through it, snow on the shoulders of his overcoat, flanked by 4 uniformed officers of the Brookline Hills Police Department and 2 detectives from the State Financial Crimes Unit. Behind them, the driveway was strobing red and blue across 30 inches of fresh snow. I stepped aside and held the door for them like a man welcoming guests to dinner, because that is precisely what I was doing. The room detonated. Bradley's mother saw the uniforms and made a sound I can only describe as a small animal noise. The crystal went out of her hand and hit the floor and burst into 1,000 glittering pieces across the rug. Bradley's father stood up so fast his chair went over backward, and then simply stood there, gray-faced with his hands half-raised, a man who had been told there would be a windfall, and had never once asked where a windfall comes from. The 4 lenders did not gasp. The 4 lenders did something much more interesting. They went absolutely still, and then, in perfect unison, they moved their hands flat onto the tablecloth. All 4, without being asked. The way men do when they have done this before and know exactly what the next 30 seconds contain. One of them, the eldest, gray at the temples, turned his head slowly and looked at Bradley Calloway, and I have seen a great many things in 70 years, but I have never seen a human face empty out with such total, arithmetical finality. He was not angry. He was recalculating. In that one look, $490,000 stopped being an investment and became a debt against a man who was about to be somewhere they could not reach him. And Bradley stood in the middle of my dining room with his chest heaving, and I watched the arrogance come off him in sheets, like paint off a hull. He raised his hands, he tried to smile. It came out as a spasm. Gentlemen, please, everyone stay calm. This is a misunderstanding." He turned toward the officers, and his voice found its footing, and God help me, he was good. He was so good. "Officers, I'm sorry, I should have called ahead. My father-in-law has advanced dementia. He's been declining for months. He's clearly had an episode and phoned this in. I'm his primary caregiver. I hold his durable power of attorney, and I have a signed neurological assessment upstairs I can produce in 90 seconds. There is no crime here. There's a sick old man who needs to be sitting down." He said it beautifully. And for one single heartbeat, I saw one of the young officers glance at me, at the white hair, at the 70 years, at the man standing alone in a doorway making no defense of himself. That is how close it is. That is how thin the margin is for every old person in this country. One articulate man in a good suit, one piece of paper, one confident sentence, and the uniform looks at you and wonders. Arthur Kellerman stepped forward onto the edge of the rug. "Save it, Mr. Calloway." He did not raise his voice either. He simply let it fill the room the way it had filled courtrooms for 3 decades. And he lifted a folded stack of paper. "We are not here for a wellness check. We are here executing arrest warrants for mortgage fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, forgery of a notarial instrument, conspiracy to commit extortion, and procurement of fraudulent medical certification for the purposes of unlawful involuntary commitment." He let each one land. "The Superior Court vacated your power of attorney at 4 o'clock this afternoon as fraudulently executed. The state's attorney froze your accounts at 4:15, including the joint account you opened on the 2nd of December. The line of credit was canceled at 4:30. He tilted his head slightly. Your neurologist in Bridgeport surrendered his license to practice at approximately 6 o'clock this evening, and is at this moment giving a rather detailed statement about the $10,000 in cash he accepted from you on the 8th of November. Bradley took a staggering step backward and hit the table. Vanessa let out a sound I had never heard from her, a long rising wail, and went down onto her knees on the rug. Bradley's mother began to sob into her husband's shoulder, and the 4 lenders sat with their hands flat on my tablecloth and their faces set like stone, because they did not care about any of it. They cared about one thing only. The money was gone, and the man who owed it to them was going somewhere with locks on it. And Bradley Calloway turned and looked at me. The hatred in that face was the purest thing I have ever seen. He raised a shaking finger and pointed it at me across my wife's table. "You have no proof." His voice came out as a hiss. "You have nothing. You're a bitter old man making accusations. And there is a signed medical opinion in this house that says your brain is rotting and it is your word against mine. You can't prove a single word of it. You can't prove anything." I did not raise my voice. I stood in that doorway with the snow coming in past my shoulders, and I reached into the inside pocket of my charcoal suit, and I took out the tablet. The screen was live, 11 camera feeds in a grid, 6 audio channels, the whole array humming quietly along the way it had hummed quietly along every day for 9 days. I turned it around so that he could see it, and I watched it arrive. I watched Bradley Calloway remember the library. I watched him remember the locked door, and the scotch, and his feet up on my desk, and the speakerphone. I watched him remember every single word he had said, in a room he believed was private, in a house he believed he had taken, in front of a man he believed was already gone. I watched him understand that the frail old man had never existed. "I don't need to prove anything, Bradley," I said quietly, and I tapped the screen. "You're going to do it for me." 15 years earlier I had run speaker cable into the ceiling of every room on that floor, because my wife liked to hear Ella Fitzgerald while she made a roast. That night the ceilings played something else. Bradley Calloway's own voice came down out of the crown molding of my dining room, crisp and warm and utterly, unmistakably his, at a volume that made the crystal ring. "The secondary problem is handled. The facility upstate sent the admission manifest this afternoon. Locked ward, private suite, they're holding the bed. We put him in the transport van on the morning of the 27th. Nobody moved, nobody breathed." Bradley's mother lifted her head off her husband's shoulder very slowly, the way you look up at a sound you hope you have misheard. "Once that van clears the driveway, we go straight to the airport. First class to Maui New Year's Eve." And then, into that vaulted, silent, beautifully decorated room, came my daughter's voice. "Are you sure the doctors will sign off on the dementia?" Vanessa, on her knees on the rug, made a small choking sound and pressed both hands over her own mouth, as though she could physically stop what was already in the air. $10,000 of the advance went to a very accommodating neurologist in Bridgeport. The report is already in the file. Advanced cognitive decline, paranoid ideation, danger to self. Airtight. I let it play. I let all of it play into the faces of Bradley's parents, who had come to my house for a Christmas dinner and were now learning, in their son's own voice, precisely what they had been seated at that table to decorate. Bradley's father sat down, not into a chair, onto the floor, with his back against the wainscoting, and he put his face in his hands and he did not take it out again. I let it play into the faces of 4 private lenders, who now understood that they had extended $500,000 to a man whose entire collateral was a crime. And I let it play into the ears of 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit, one of whom had begun quietly to take notes. When the loop reached the laughter, when the room filled with the sound of Bradley Calloway and Vanessa Hensley laughing together about the transport van, I reached over and stopped it. The silence afterward was the loudest thing in that house. The lead officer stepped forward and said the words, and I found that I did not need to hear them. I watched instead. I watched them turn my son-in-law around and put his hands behind his back. And I watched the man who had shouted, "Get out, you're not invited," at me across my wife's table be walked out of my dining room, past my Christmas tree, through my foyer, and out my front door into the snow. He did not look at me. He looked at the floor the entire way. I went to the window. The cruisers were strobing red and blue against 30 inches of white, and the long shadows swung back and forth across a lawn I had mowed for 30 years. They put him in the back of the second car. He looked very small in there. Stripped of the suit's authority, stripped of the voice, stripped of the story. Just a 34-year-old man in the back of a car, discovering that the world contains consequences. The doors slammed, the engines turned over, and the lights went down my driveway and dissolved into the falling snow until there was nothing out there at all but weather. The house went quiet, and behind me on the floor, my daughter was still on her knees. I turned from the glass. Vanessa had crawled. She had crossed the rug on her hands and knees in her mother's pearls, and she reached me and threw her arms around my legs and pressed her face against my knees, and she began to weep. Great, hysterical, tearing sobs that filled that empty dining room and bounced off the abandoned crystal, and the spilled wine soaking dark into the linen. "Daddy, Daddy, I'm so sorry." Her tears came through the wool of my trousers. I could feel them cold on my shins. He manipulated me. "Daddy, you don't understand. He got inside my head. He made me believe you were failing. He showed me things. He told me we were protecting the family's assets, that you'd thank us. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to send you away to that place. He made me. Please, please, Daddy, forgive me." I looked down at the top of my daughter's head. I looked at the shoulders I had carried her on, at the hair I had brushed after her mother died, and she could not lift her own arms to do it, at the woman I had raised and fed and protected and loved without condition and without ceiling for 32 years. And I waited. I want you to understand that. I waited. I stood there in complete silence, and I waited for the thing that had always come. The automatic, involuntary, bone-deep paternal reflex that had fired every single time this child had ever cried in my presence. The reflex that had gotten me out of bed at 3 in the morning for 32 years. The one that is not a decision. The one that simply happens to a man. I waited for it, and there was nothing there, nothing at all. Not pity, not anger, not even grief. Just an enormous, silent, level clarity like standing on a finished site at dawn. The well was dry. It had not been drained that night. It had been drained slowly over 8 months, and I had simply been too busy surviving to check the gauge. I reached down. I took hold of my daughter's fingers, and one by one, with a gentleness that surprised me, I peeled them off my legs. And I took a step backward. She dropped onto the hardwood and looked up at me with her makeup in ruins, and her face open with terror, still waiting, even now, even after all of it, for her father to appear and make the consequences go away. "He manipulated your mind," I repeated. My voice was flat, entirely level. "You were a victim. You were caught in his web. You never wanted to hurt me. You were forced." I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket. My fingers found the small folded slip of paper I had been carrying against my chest for 3 days. I took it out. I unfolded it under the hard white glare of the chandelier, and I let it drop. It fluttered down and landed on the floor in front of her knees. Vanessa looked at it, and her sobbing stopped as though a switch had been thrown. It was a receipt. A computer-printed receipt from a pawn shop in the industrial district. One of those places with bars on the windows and no questions on the form. She knew exactly what it was. I watched her know. "Your mother's necklace," I said. The words went into that room like ingots into water. 2 carats, flawless. The one I saved 3 years to buy her. The one she wore through every day of her illness. The one she took off in a hospital room and put into my hand and asked me, in the last clear conversation she and I ever had, to make sure went to you. I looked down at my only child. Bradley forged my signature. Bradley bought the doctor. Bradley brought loan sharks to my Christmas table. I will testify to every word of it, and I will watch him go to prison for all of it. But Bradley did not do this. You walked up my staircase. You opened my safe with a code your mother gave you when she was dying, because she trusted you with it. And you took her diamond out of the velvet, and you drove it downtown, and you sold your mother's memory for $11,000. To buy your husband 6 more weeks with dangerous men. Bradley did not manipulate you into that, Vanessa. He wasn't in the room. That was your hand. That was your car. That was your choice. She opened her mouth. Something started to form. Another explanation, another version, another architecture of blame. And then it simply died in her throat, because the paper was on the floor between us, and there is nothing you can say to a receipt. She stared at it, and her body began to shake with a new kind of fear entirely. Not the fear of being punished. The fear of being seen. Love is not a blank check, Vanessa, I said it quietly. I have never in my life needed to say an important thing loudly. You believed my love was an infinite resource. You believed it was a well with no bottom, that you could draw on it forever, that no matter what you did to me, it would still be there in the morning, because that is what fathers are. And you were nearly right. It was very, very deep. But a well is a structure, and every structure has a limit. And you did not simply drink from it. You poisoned it and then complained about the taste. You assumed that because I am your father, I would absorb it. The lies, the basement, your mother's vanity in a dumpster, the men in my dining room, the van on the 27th. You assumed I would absorb all of it and still leave you the kingdom because I always had. Because I always had. But love without respect is not love. It is access. It is a door somebody left unlocked, and there is always someone who will walk through it and take what is inside and call it family. You stripped the respect out first. You did that 8 months ago, the day you sat in my living room with tears in your eyes and asked to move in. Everything after that was just demolition on a building you had already condemned. The moment you signed those papers, you decided that my life, my freedom, and my mind were worth less than a beach in Maui. I am not the confused old man you tried to file away in a locked ward. I am the engineer who built this house from the footings up, and I am the man who is taking it back tonight. I pulled back my cuff and looked at my watch. It was 3 minutes past 9. You have 60 minutes. You will go upstairs. You will pack what fits in your car. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter. You will not take furniture. You will not take art. You will take your clothing, and you will walk out of my front door. If you are inside these walls at 10 o'clock, I will call those officers back to this property, and I will press felony charges for the theft of that necklace, and I will testify, and you will spend Christmas in a cell 12 miles from the room you grew up in. The choice is entirely yours. It always was. She scrambled to her feet. She had spent 32 years reading my face, and she read it correctly for perhaps the first time in a year. There was nothing left in it to appeal to. She turned and ran up the grand staircase, and I stood in that bright empty foyer and listened to my daughter tear through my house. Drawers wrenched open, hangers stripped, a suitcase thrown flat on a bed above my head. 50 minutes later she came down the stairs with 2 canvas bags, her face entirely hidden behind her hair. She did not look at me. She pulled the heavy front door open and went out into the snow. I stood on the porch in my shirt sleeves and watched her taillights go down the long driveway and turn out onto the road and disappear. Then I took out my phone and called the locksmith who had been parked 2 blocks down in an unmarked van since 7 that evening. And I told him he could come up now. He was in the foyer within 20 minutes. I stood and watched him work. He pulled the brass cylinders out of the front double doors, the side entrance, the patio gates, the garage, the basement. Every lock in the house. I watched the tumblers come out and new ones go in, and I found that the ritual of it was doing something to me that I had not expected. With every click of his tools, I was closing a breach. I paid him in cash. I thanked him for coming out on Christmas Eve, and I shook his hand, and I closed my new front door and threw the new deadbolt, and it landed with a heavy, final, beautiful thud. I listened to his van go down the drive, and then there was nothing. For the first time in 8 months, I was alone in my own house. I walked through it slowly. The pressure was gone. That is the only way I can describe it. That constant, low, grinding atmospheric pressure, the manufactured cheer, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the permanent low hum of a threat I could not name, had simply lifted the way weather lifts. I walked past the dining table, where the spilled wine had dried into the linen, past the broken crystal still glittering on the rug, where Bradley's mother had dropped it, past the 8 place settings, 7 of them abandoned mid-meal, and one of them a plain ceramic plate and a plain fork at the head of the table. I left all of it exactly where it was. I would deal with it in the morning. There was no hurry. There was, in fact, nothing but time. I went to the sideboard and poured myself a very generous measure of scotch from a bottle I had been saving for a reason I had never quite articulated, and I found the reason. I did not have to pretend my hands shook. I did not have to manufacture a tremble or a vacant stare, or ask a question I already knew the answer to. My mind was clear and sharp and entirely my own. I carried the glass to the leather armchair in front of the fireplace and sat down, and the warmth came up into my bones. Above the mantel hangs an oil portrait of Eleanor, painted the year she turned 50. She is looking slightly off to the left at something out of frame, with an expression she wore whenever I said something ridiculous, and she had decided not to embarrass me about it. I raised my glass to her. I had kept my promise. I had not let two thieves take what we spent 40 years building. I had defended the house, and I had defended the legacy, and most importantly, I had defended my own dignity, which, I have come to understand, was the only thing they were ever actually after. The money was incidental. To take a man's money, you need his signature. To take a man's house, you need his mind. They came from my mind first because everything else follows. The snow kept falling past the bay windows, burying the driveway, burying the tire tracks, burying all of it under a clean, silent, indifferent white. The storm was over, and the old engineer was still standing. That was 19 months ago. I want to tell you what happened afterward, and then I want to tell you what I have learned. Because if this story is only a story about a father who won, then it is entertainment, and I did not survive it in order to entertain you. Bradley Calloway pleaded out. 8 years. He will serve perhaps 5. The lenders were never charged with anything, because men like that are never charged with anything. They simply moved on to the next man with a house and a weakness. The notary lost his commission. The neurologist in Bridgeport lost his license and is, last I heard, selling medical devices somewhere in Ohio, which is a sentence of a different kind. Vanessa was not charged. Arthur begged me to. He was right, legally, and I have never once regretted the decision, and I could not tell you exactly why I made it. She was charged in every way that matters. She lives in a studio apartment in Waterbury and works retail, and has not in 19 months contacted me. I did not forgive her. I want to be very direct about that, because I know what you expect from a story like this. You expect the old man by the fire to soften. You expect a phone call at the end, a Christmas 2 years later, a grandchild, a reconciliation, the whole warm apparatus of the thing we have all been taught to want. I did not forgive her, and I am at peace. Here is what I have learned at 71 in a quiet house. Forgiveness is not a debt you owe. We are taught by films, by sermons, by well-meaning friends who have never had their signature forged, that forgiveness is a moral obligation, and that a man who withholds it is poisoning himself. That is not true, and I think it does enormous damage. Forgiveness is a gift, and a gift that can be demanded is not a gift. It is a tax. What I owed my daughter was 32 years of unconditional love, and I paid every installment of it in full. And there is no clause in that contract that obligated me to hand her the knife back afterward and apologize for the blood on it. I do not hate Vanessa. I wish her a decent life. But peace and forgiveness are not the same country, and I have found that you can live very comfortably in one without ever visiting the other. Blood is not a permission slip. We have built a culture in which the word family functions as a skeleton key. It opens every door, silences every objection, and shames every person who asks a reasonable question. But blood is not a license to exploit. It is not an entitlement to your labor, your savings, your home, or your dignity. If a stranger had done to me what my daughter did, no one on earth would have told me to consider her feelings. The relationship does not change the arithmetic of the harm. It only changes how much it hurts. Watch for the invoice, not the insult. This is the practical one, and if you take nothing else from an old man's story, take this. Abuse of the elderly almost never arrives as cruelty. It arrives as concern. It arrives with tears in its eyes. It arrives saying those stairs aren't safe, and we just worry about you, and wouldn't it be easier if we handled the bills? Every single step of my demolition was framed as a kindness, and every objection I might have raised would have made me the ungrateful one. That is the design. If you are ever in a room where saying no to something would make you a bad person, and saying yes would cost you a piece of your autonomy, you are not in a conversation. You are in a negotiation, and you should behave accordingly. Never surrender the instruments. They came for my mind before they came for my money, and they came for it with love in their voices. This is the cruelest mechanism in the whole apparatus. Convince a person that their own perception is unreliable, and you no longer have to hide anything from them. They will hide it from themselves. If someone in your life is consistently, gently, lovingly correcting your memory of events you were present for, write it down. Date it. Keep the receipts. Not because you are paranoid, but because a record is the only thing in this world that cannot be talked out of what it saw. I survived because a bank wrote me a letter, and because a man was too arrogant to bag his own shredding. And this, which is the one I did not expect. For 8 months I was ashamed, not of them, of myself. A man who spent 40 years detecting structural failure sat at his own table and could not see it. I thought that made me a fool. It did not. It made me a widower. Grief is not stupidity. Grief is a legitimate load, and it uses up your safety factor the same way wind and snow and time do. And there is no shame in a structure that has been fully loaded being less able to take another blow. What I mistook for my own idiocy was simply the cost of having loved someone for 40 years. I would not give that back. Not 1 hour of it, not to have seen Bradley Calloway coming a year earlier. So if you are listening to this, and you have been taken by a child, a sibling, a partner, someone you would have died for, I want you to hear this from someone who has been there. You were not a fool. You were a person who loved somebody, and love opens doors, and that is not a flaw in you. It is the whole reason you are worth anything at all. The failure was theirs. It was always entirely theirs. Your final years are not a resource to be harvested. They are not a waiting room. They are not a bridge to somebody else's inheritance. They are yours. They are the ones you paid for, with every early morning and every missed weekend and every dollar you did not spend on yourself. Guard them. Guard your mind, your name, your signature, and your peace. Stand firm, and if the whole world tells you that you owe them one more piece of yourself, you do not. You never did. If this story reached you tonight, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone you would have given everything to? And tell me which city you're watching from. It means more to me than you know to see where these words travel. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you next time. This story, like everything on this channel, was written, structured, and told by a human being. The narration you've just heard came out of a real understanding of what betrayal feels like, and it was shaped by hand, sentence by sentence, over many hours, because I believe stories about human dignity deserve to be made by humans. Names, places, and identifying details have been changed. Some elements are dramatized for narrative structure, but the emotional truth underneath it, the way loneliness makes a person available, the way cruelty disguises itself as care, the way a person can love their child completely and still, one day, have to close the door. That is real, and it belongs to more families than anyone wants to admit. If you recognized your own life somewhere in these words, you are not alone, you are not foolish, and it is not too late. Take care of yourself. Take care of your parents, and never let anyone make you small in a house you built.